to mention, for those of you who've not interacted with the IEA before, the IEA is a public policy think tank, and our mission is to inform decision-making in Kenya through policy, innovation, research, and dialogues. So part of the IEA's primary goals, we seek to educate the public on importance on the performance of Kenya's economy, one, and in addition, to promote an effective and accountable government. So in line with those two goals, we have undertaken some analysis, and which we'll be sharing with you in the next hour or so. We have a presentation that will be made by two of my colleagues, basically setting out or discussing some of our insights from the findings of that audit report on the e-citizen. I think most of you have interacted or perhaps heard in the media about that specific audit report that basically raised specific or significant questions on governance, on weaknesses in controls, on basically the management of the e-citizen platform, the infrastructure, the legal and policy questions that were raised by the Auditor General were significant and are likely to have great implications in terms of utilization of public funds. You know, government had indicated that going forward, the primary method of collection of revenue was through that platform. And given the fact that the OAG has now raised significant questions on just basically the platform, the lawfulness and effectiveness of the revenues raising as detailed in that platform, I think it calls for us to have a discussion and to examine the main issues arising around that platform. So to basically help us understand a little more on those systemic weaknesses that have been identified in the e-citizen platform, we will have a two-part presentation that will be made by two of my colleagues, as I'd mentioned earlier. So we'll begin with Leo Kemboi, who is a program officer in the CLE program. We work together in that program. And then after Leo, we will have Kwame come in later with the main policy insights. And Kwame is the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Leo to take us through the first part of the presentation.
So the Auditor General conducted the special audit on the e-citizen platform. I think majority of us are already aware of the existence of the platform. It is now almost 11 years in existence, 15 more than 11 years in existence, and but generally it has been a major platform that government. Part of the government's modernization program that was started in 2014 was to provide an end-to-end collection mechanism for a revenue collection mechanism for the government of Kenya. So there have been complaints and subsequent findings in the Auditor General reports from 2017 on material questions regarding either revenue policy and also regarding the lawfulness of the application. So in doing so, the Parliament raised a question and required that the Auditor General conduct the specialized audit, and the Auditor General moved forward to provide that. So what we will provide today is a synthesis of what we've seen in the report, and now we've divided into these areas. the issues and also the policy questions. And then my Kwame will provide what are the policy lessons that needs to be dealt with. The government payment systems is not a new thing. First, in high and middle income economies, and almost all government transactions are done online, and they are linked to secure digital IDs, what we call the unique personal identifiers. And they use it for many things, including salaries, welfare, pensions, and it's part of automating government in light of the digital age that government is. And you can see it in other countries like India, Brazil, and Kenya. So, and mostly they are what we call the inbound payments and the outbound payments. But the focus of eCitizen is likely on inbound payments, which is taxes, license fees, fines for some cases, and also the question of utilities. But now, for us to provide a context, eCitizen is a government of Kenya application that was developed that was paid for by the IFC, International Finance Corporation. The IFC supported the development of that system. The Cabinet Secretary, National Treasury, in 2014 had developed regulations, and part of it was as a memo detailing what should be in that the payment platform. One of them was that it should eliminate human interaction, it should be real time, and it should be automated from end to end. But now controversy arose, and the question of the ownership of the system is a matter that is people say disputed. But the Auditor General in the audit report settles it, because the Auditor General identifies the chain of development of eCitizen from the start, how IFC paid for the support, how they did the handover to Government of Kenya, the handed contracts, source code, business case, and handover notes to Treasury via the handover letter. And we've quoted a specific section of that paragraph, as you can see, that the ownership and control of the system is actually Government of Kenya system. So for us, it's just before we raise all the other questions, is to just allay the fears and show that the system is owned by Government of Kenya. Now, we'll present two things. So in the audit report, the Auditor General has identified what are called systemic weaknesses. And then because of those systemic weaknesses, they now raised specific questions. So the first point is for us to show the systemic weakness. One of the big issues identified by the Auditor General was the question of was the question of the legal framework. So there's no legal framework to govern operation and management of the government digital payment system. Remember that this is a transition. This is a transition. Government is transitioning from manual systems to now systems that are automated end to end. And there are specific things that when a system for system-based revenue systems that problems, and as a result of that question of no legal framework, there is a risk problem, and one of it is the legal disputes, which is already happening. There's a question of public trust, where and you can see from many engagements in public affairs platforms in Kenya, that has been raised. And what legal, if there is no, for government, the reason why, unlike private sector entities, even for private sector entities, such would be required, board resolutions would be required for such kind of, and other legal tools would be required to manage that. And that you see that there's a problem of the problem of legal accountability has raised now the question of efficiencies and compromise in collection of revenue. Another problem is the problems of governance structure. So in between government of Kenya, there is a vendor. There are vendors, two vendors, and one of those, the ICT authority was responsible for managing payments to the vendor, and that role has not been provided in any legal instrument. And given that there was no oversight body dedicated to now deal with the questions of decision making, and that has had problems with compliance questions, but also system failures and the downtime questions issues, and also data breaches. An important aspect of any technology component is what we call the standard operating procedures. The standard operating procedures now provides of how user access management is done, how services are onboarded, how collection and settlement of revenue is done, and the reconciliation. Remember, in the PFM system, government, when we pay for government services, it's considered appropriation in aid, and that appropriation in aid is already budgeted for by Parliament. So when that revenue is collected, it's supposed to go back to the MDS. So there should be a mechanism of how that service is put forward on the platform. When Kenyan citizens, consumers pay for that service, how that revenue is collected, how it's put together, reconciled, and how it's sent back to the same MDA. Another problem is the question of the vendor. There was the Auditor General identified from our assessment what we see as a dual mandate. There are no clear roles for the vendor and the government of Kenya. And that is important because to ensure accountability, oversight of operational activities, and the environment was what is characterized as what you'd say highly informal, with no specific roles on who does system overrides, who approves changes in the system, how sensitive citizen information is processed. And there's a question about the digital payment gateway, what was found. Another key finding that the Auditor General found was, remember, in between from the collection point, in the system, there is the platform. There are financial service providers, which are the banks, who, because this is integrated through mobile money, and that and other payment forms, including card services. That money is sent to a financial service provider, who then send it back to a national treasury settlement account. And once that national treasury settlement account, that's when now the reconciliations are done, and that money is sent to the MDS. The Auditor General found out that the National Treasury had not signed the legal agreements with financial service provider engaged in collection and settlement of that revenue. There are also specific general, but also specific platform weaknesses that and this has been shown through the eCitizen platform downtime. But the most important thing that indicts this system is the problem that I'm going to mention, which is remember the CS Treasury in 2014 had indicated that the digital payment system would be fully automated. It will be real time. It will eliminate human interaction, and that it will allow now broader oversight. However, the finding of the Auditor General is that the current implementation regime does not settle revenue collected directly to MDS accounts. Instead, it's directed to various accounts, and then it's transferred to the settlement account at Treasury, and then manually reconciled. So this is not end-to-end automated system, and that beats the justification for requiring the eCitizen platform in the first place. So that's the major thing, and this is something that will form the basis of our policy discussion today. Now, because of those systemic problems, there are specific issues that the Auditor General raised, and I'll just mention them in passing, because this is just to give a context on the kind of problems. So because of that, the manual processes and the custody and flow of funds, there's a delay in fund remittances between the collection point and to the respective MDS and county governments. And the average delay is something like 8 days. And the major reason is now due to that manual settlement and other inefficiencies. The Auditor General found also that receipts in the settlement account could not be linked to any invoices from the M-Pesa flow system due to from the PESA flow, not M-Pesa, PESA flow system due to partial payments, erroneous payments, duplicate payments. Ideally, we've studied some of the payment systems outside this continent, and one of the things that comes out clearly is that when a consumer is invoiced for a service, there is a unique transaction ID, which now links it to when the consumer pays, that transaction ID links the invoice to the receipt. And that provides a clear view of what was paid and of what was invoiced, what was demanded, and what was paid for. And that allows, even where there are partial payments, that settlement process becomes an efficient process. So this is more of a technology problem. And that indicates that there is a problem. Indicates a problem of revenue traceability and accountability. Another thing is that the reconciliation of services offered with reports from eCitizens and money received from Treasury was manually done. And remember that government services, the number of people requesting government services is a big number, and this increases the workload, and also because of the human element provides increases the number of the number of errors, and then provides difficulty in tracking funds. So, for example, one of those inconsistencies in settlement reports is that the Auditor General looked at the report for tourism fund, indicated that 2.2 billion shillings was due for settlement. However, when the summation of weekly reports used to settle collections, it totaled 1.72 B, showing a variance of 515 million. And that shows the problem that the inadequacies in the e-citizen reporting module and raising concerns on about reliability and accuracy of the settlement reports. Another thing is identified was the competitiveness of goods and services. Remember that there government sells goods and services of all kinds. There are those that are low priced. So, and they use an example of KVDA, 20 grams of honey at 20 bob. But that 20 bob is subjected to a convenience fee of 50 shillings. And that is a transaction, that a service cost of 250 in product cost. See that kind of, this is the kind of the problem that and Kwame would explain, and Kwame will explain what does this mean for policy. Another problem is a convenience fee. The original memo had required that a convenience fee be prorated and in recognition of that problem. But however, what prevailed was the flat fee of that. And even if it had been prorated at 5 shillings, it'd still be at 25% cost on the same. The second thing is that it does not account for how government services are provided. And a very good example that they used is the healthcare. In healthcare, when you go to an hospital, you are registered. There's a registration cost. There is consultation. After consultation, you have to go to the lab. And again, after the lab reports have been reviewed, to the pharmacy. At each point, there was a convenience fee because this is a technology platform. There's a convenience fee. So you realize that part of it is there's a convenience that and that adds up cumulatively and raises the costs. Another issue identified was the question of help desk management for incidences. So there's no structured help desk system on how to track reported. So tracking reported incidences and resolution was difficult, and that prolonged delays and client frustration. And payment, given the fact that you have payment at every service point, if there's an issue with that payment at that service point and you're required to go to the move to the next place, you'd end up being denied services because of that resolved issue at the process and the service point. Another thing was the question of irregularities now in revenue collection and processing. Part of it is there's a vendor and there were irregular payments paid for the e-citizen platform support and maintenance contract. And that firm that was paid was not a party to the contract. And then in the contract, there's a provision for payment of gateway services. Government has paid for a gateway service. And then again, government went and paid in the contract for that service. So government can't pay for its own, and the Auditor General identified a question because government cannot pay for the use of its own platform. Another question was now an account that was not listed among approved collection accounts by National Treasury, an account that was not listed as among approved accounts was used to collect revenues. And then again, the 222 payment, a review of the 222 payment showed that some transactions were made to private entities instead of the designated settlement account. And that documentation, approval and documentation to support those transfers was not provided. Another issue is the question about that eCitizen had two PesaFlow payment gateways that were running in parallel. There was an old one, but now when more services were onboarded, there was a new one that was developed. There was no approval for the development of the new gateway. There was no data protection assessment that was done, data protection assessment. There was additionally, the government digital payment unit did not provide authorization letters for 4 bank accounts that were configured in the eCitizen platform. And then there's a question about the Gazette Notice 9290 of 2014 required the nominal admin fee to be charged per transaction to be prorated by percentage paid, but this wasn't prorated. And there was an estimation that was provided by the Auditor General that overcharge in the overcharge in the other system in the old gateway was 30.73 million shillings, and in the new gateway it was 319 million shillings. Now, given those systemic problems and some of the key issues that were identified by the Auditor General, what does this mean for policy? So one, there's a problem of the legal custody and flow of public funds. The audit found out that billions in collection and settlement accounts were held outside Treasury's control with no clear legal time limits for remittance. And that's a problem. And now the PFM, part of the thing could require that the PFM be amended, the PFM Act be amended, or a new legislation in government digital payment regulations be passed to now define settlement timelines. Require it to go through the CBK will give a more in the end, and also provide penalties for breaches, because holding money outside Treasury's control is not something that Chapter 12 of the Constitution there was anticipation that Chapter 12 of the Constitution would allow. Another problem is now the question of automation. The ground is that the finding in the Auditor General reports was that there were manual processes in the eCitizen implementation regime. And so we need to define what automation means in this context. It requires financial reconciliation, settlement to Treasury and MDS, the exception detection and escalation, compliant enforcement fees, automated reporting to oversight bodies. So the entire workflow should be end-to-end, automation from one end to another. And then, so the second question about automation is also processes and payments that cannot be reversed. That's also a compliance. That part of it is there should be a basis for automatic refunds. And then because of the customer care problems, that these processes and complaints around the same should be automated, and there be an help desk. And that now again is tied to transaction IDs for resolution. On the question of the flat fee convenience, flat fee convenience fee, just to go with the two examples, it actually it discourages purchase. It makes government retail appear overpriced, actually overpriced, and that it also raises the access questions of public services. And this for the healthcare, you're accessing the same service, but you're charged multiple convenience fees at each point in the lab, in consultation, registration, and that kind of the thing actually adds up to the medical service cost. All these provides that it creates many problems, equity problems, the adoption risk. So if costs are already provided through in the budget, if government is paying for the digital, owns the digital gateway, if government is paying for salaries, if government is paying for the entire cost, why should be a convenience fee be charged? It can only, convenience fees are only charged actually only in a PPP model, where a private sector owns the system and government doesn't own, and government has not invested in that. But where in the case of eCitizen, where government has where the source code for the eCitizen was developed through government donor support, government support through IFC, and the government pays for the contracts and many other things. Costs should be recovered, are already recovered through the budget. So there should be no payment of those convenience fees. Now I end at this and request Kwame to take it up from there.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So thanks a lot. So what Leo has done is to provide an introduction to other places or other national jurisdictions that have systems such as this, where government uses IT and digital tools to actually collect its own revenue. And then he's talking about why there's a good business case for those kind of systems, partly because obviously it's supposed to provide unbroken chain. It provides record keeping. Of course, it's more efficient. Among other things, it crowds in government revenue in one source. It makes it easier to follow, and obviously reduces the transaction cost for government. Then what he then asked is whether the audit report reveals the government of Kenya actually benefits from similar, or rather the expected or the rationale for the introduction of government digital payment systems. And the audit report finds very many key systemic weaknesses. And on the basis of those systemic weaknesses, Leo has provided us with specific examples about what those are. Now we come to this part of our conversation, and here, beg your pardon, it's not necessarily to rehash what has happened, it's just to ask us, in the government of Kenya's journey, or in its partnerships with the various, rather as part of its IT policy and trying to actually digitize systems or provide itself, or rather in its interaction with partners or people who provide these kind of services, what are some of the common policy lessons that we see? And these common policy lessons are generic because they provide us with critical assessments, or rather some evidence about what similar mistakes government tends to make as it deals with this. And so remember that this is not the only, the eCitizen is not the only time in which government has subjected, so to speak, processes that are required by law or its management systems to a digital enterprise or some form of digitization. We have all this. Leo provided some of them, but we know it about basically whether you call it Huduma number, whether you call it e-teams, all kinds of these things are about basically trying to build databases and to provide a mechanism for government to benefit from the great efficiencies that come from digitization of services. You also remember the voting system that we had, where we had electronic voter ID on one side, and then we had a mechanism for the transmission of results. And you know how all those things have gone, usually releasing or showing significant weaknesses. But that's not the problem. Every system can have weaknesses, and audits actually show how they should be implemented. What we're talking here is that we see the same kind of errors, some glaring, some technical, some of them based, in our view, on the same weaknesses that suggest that learning is not taking place, but some of them just based on perhaps willful neglect of what the best practice should be. So the first one is basically that if you look at the audit and all that, government is one big enterprise, and it's therefore an information enterprise, where information moving across government departments, moving between various arms of government, and moving between government and citizens. Now, the Auditor General in this, or rather the report of the Auditor General states that this audit was not complete, in the sense that not complete in the sense that it did not have, or did not do a comprehensive audit and could not answer all the questions, because the Treasury itself, in addition to the vendor, failed to provide certain key information, but that information and those reports were actually available to them. So here you see that there are bureaucratic incentives to create knowledge gaps, because knowledge gaps are the way systems such as these digital systems are actually about moving knowledge and moving information out there. Now, the reason we mention this is we know it. You remember the examples of whether it's a Duma number, whether it's in the procurement of these systems, usually the transparency that is required to support the procurement of these systems, to actually give everybody the confidence that these systems are performing as was required, is usually lacking. And we see internal incentives, in this case in the Treasury itself, to delay or prevent entirely a complete picture about the performance of this system being done here. You may read that as you do, but my view is that that shows you a systematic effort in the public sector for non-disclosure about key government operations. Whatever it is they cite, and in our view, especially if you read Article 201A of the Constitution, which talks about total transparency of systems for public finance management, and this is one specific public finance management, especially the revenue collection side. So the idea that certain information should not be made available to the Auditor General, who's an officer of Parliament for parliamentary scrutiny, in my view, is something we should read as mischief. So that's the first one. The second one is basically we see government over-reliance on vendors. Whether you talk about the e-voter system or, voter identification systems, whatever those names are, right? Now, you see an over-reliance on vendors to the extent that government itself, as the person who's paying, is almost being led by the nose by what vendors decide is useful to disclose or to provide or not. So for instance, now there are platform-specific weaknesses here that are being defended as proprietary rights. So for instance, this platform has certain parts which are completely manual and certain parts that are digitized. And from what you can say, the assertion is, while the contradiction is that while the source code for the development of what we now call e-system was actually provided as assistance in part from the International Financial Corporation or the World Bank, one arm of the World Bank, assistance to the government of Kenya. And part of the requirements of those contracts were that this facility developed from that contract would actually be owned by the IFC, which was then handed over to the government. And the government of Kenya has letters and memorandums confirming that that handover took place. However, the people who own these e-citizen, well, you see them coming out in public forums every now and again, or being interviewed on TV, very weak interviewers to start with, blabbering around about how they have specific contracts, some part of it cannot be revealed, and stuff like that. And so the platform-specific weaknesses, which make the system entirely unfit, in some cases for purposes are actually being defended. You saw this as well with, was it MOFO or whoever those people who are providing the elections. And I mentioned specifically the election system because all these are governed by constitutional requirements. And yet Kenya's, or the people, the citizens, quote unquote, rights or interest to actually transparent systems are usually undermined by the fact that the vendor would not allow this. So it's not just about these elections. I know that's very toxic for many people. It's not just about e-citizens here. You talked about it in IFMIS, and we're now in the process of the e-procurement part of IFMIS, and I can bet you that these same weaknesses will replicate themselves. And part of that is basically the absence of learning, but in our view, government making the same mistakes in in every transaction here. And one of the things that the third point is basically that the nature of the first bureaucratic incentive to actually block knowledge or information and platform-specific weaknesses, if you put those two together, they tend to lead in locking of government data, and that leads to a high cost of migration. So what that happens is, in the over-reliance on the vendor and what they can provide, we can't even see 7 service level agreements here. There's no risk assessment on a regular basis, which suggests that actually those are being covered. But what we see is the government of Kenya is locked in government data. So for instance, if there are no service level agreements and a firm which was initially hired to provide a website or an interface is acting as if it is the owner of the entire system, what that means is that some of that data, as you can tell, was not available for overall scrutiny by the Auditor General's office. And what this does is the same thing, which is because of a proprietary right, it's locking government data or public data and makes it very, very difficult for government to find an alternative. So in other words, through this agreement, all the operations of this agreement, the government of Kenya, and some of the data related to transactions that we run with the government during the payments do not seem to belong or are not explicitly stated as the property of the government of Kenya. What that means is that should this system be shut, and you can tell, as Leo has mentioned, it has significant weaknesses which affect its ability to stay on, right, for a very, very long time. I mean, because of the over-reliance on it and the number of transaction volumes that it can handle. And we've all seen in the last year, I think, reports about one time when it was not necessarily available. That might have been a blip, but it was a significant one. But I think the thing that worries us is generally government surrenders public data to a private sector firm. And that's not just bad in itself. We even think it's against the law. But the point for that is that it is deliberate on the part of the private person. Why? Because it locks government, because the costs of moving to an alternative vendor would be extremely costly. And that locks in an efficient system and also takes away the incentive for this provider or vendor to actually provide a continuing service, because they're not scared of competition. They lock in competition. Now, that was not declared by the Auditor General, but I suspect one of the things that some of these systems are, this poor mechanism design, is entirely to actually lock in government for a long term within this, and perhaps even provide monopoly rights to government to deal with a significant vendor. It's unheard of that a government's payment system gateway, rather, is actually not in government's hands. And so providing somebody else with that opportunity is really, really interesting. So what should government own if not? Anyway, the third one is the fourth one is basically that we see here that the Auditor General has suggested that there should be an enforcement, or rather there should be a handover. Well, there are no handover of the gateway and the systems to the government or the treasury. I think there's a suggestion, of course, that this decision is acute to ensure, I mean, this is an imperative and almost urgent to ensure that the weaknesses that have been identified are resolved, and resolved quickly, because government would have the incentive to fix them. But the enforcement of this handover is an issue. And in our view, it's not going to happen unless Parliament or a different arm of government actually forces it. Treasury, which is supposed to be the custodian and the main interlocutor with these vendors, seems to be comfortable with this system as it does. Of course, we've seen representations before Parliament, and we're not too sure. There's a very cool assessment, which is on the whole suggesting that this Treasury and its key officers are satisfied here. But we don't think they should be given the option to actually determine on their own terms. This is a system that is failing on its own terms. The Treasury Secretary in 2014 already gave a memorandum which required that this system be foolproof and the entire system should be digitized, so that we have a significant proportion of this being handled manually is already showing that this system is failing on its own terms. So an enforcement of that handover, in our view, should be required, and we don't think it's going to be. It's going to happen. We all know every time courts ask for a handover, you all remember the critical case in 2017 during the presidential court petition at the Supreme Court. The courts ordered for the handover of the data. At the conclusion of the case, the handover was not done. So here, again, we see that unless political action on one side, legislative action on the other, and where possible, even the law is required, that data should be handing over. I mean, that facility should be handed over. But we don't see that the Treasury is in a hurry to take custody of this gateway, because in our view, it should be handed over, and the CBK should be the custodian. I mean, should have the regulator of what this kind of system is. Why? Because this is an additional factor in Kenya's payment system. Remember, the government of Kenya collects revenues equivalent to about 19% of Kenya's GDP. That's a lot of transactions on a day-to-day basis, but it's also a lot of money concerned here. Of course, some of it circulates one back and forth. But on the whole, it's suggesting that when you have a system such as that, it's definitely a monopoly in that way, being handled on behalf of government, but relying on an external person for whom access to key offices such as the Auditor General being unavailable, especially on a day-to-day basis, then obviously that handover question becomes extremely important and urgent. The second set of policy questions, if you see one of the things that you see here, just like all these other systems that are handled to the government of Kenya, one sees a commission focus or a revenue focus on the vendors, and that's particularly okay. But the problem with the commission focus, so for instance, as Leo has mentioned, an arbitrary sum of 50 shillings per transaction was set up, and it has very many unintended consequences, right? Such that when somebody is buying or transacting with government, remember all government departments were forced, almost compelled, to go to manage their transactions through this system. And so somebody in the Kerio Valley buying honey from the Kerio Valley Development Authority at 20 shillings, but has to pay, in addition to 20 shillings, 50 shillings in terms of vendor costs. Fees. The Auditor General mentions this is obviously not just unjust, but it's poor design. And why can't it be adjusted? Because it's clear that it's not government that actually perhaps even determined that amount, which should have been first irregular, but also very, very peculiar, because government should ought to have been determining if access fees are required into the process, into the system. It should have been designed by government, but it looks like, again, the vendor is here. And that commission definitely goes back to the vendor. So that commission focus happens about how information can even be shared. So again, repeating the same mistakes and looking for every banana skin, so to which government and the Treasury particularly could just skid and fall. The OAG has recommended these investigations. It has not mentioned it, but in our view, it's very, very clear that a forensic audit of the entire system. Remember, this was a more or less a specialized audit and therefore systems audit largely. But it disclosed certain weaknesses that suggest perhaps government has lost revenues and has not lost revenues just because of poor design. Some of them seem to be very systematic and perhaps were designed in that way to leak government revenue. So for instance, regardless of what the PFM laws and the Constitution requires, in addition to government's regulations and public finance, certain gateways were opened, and the accounts that were opened and receiving money from this system without the authorization of the Treasury, or the Treasury, the Cabinet Secretary and the Principal Secretaries. Those are just patent violations of law. And so the OAG has recommended further investigations on the criminal side. We do not know whether the ESCC or the Directorate of Criminal Investigation will take its own initiative to do this, but it's suggesting altogether, again, every time these systems tend to be audited, this almost comes out as a significant finding again. Now, what do we think? I think, in our view, having revealed those about what's wrong, let's also be clear, some revenue is coming in, but the audit around the revenue trail is not possible to actually have from one side to the other. So that's, but in our view, and the Auditor General has also recommended the government should take full ownership of the gateway. We do not think there's a legal impediment, even though some of the communication we are hearing from the people who are managing is suggesting that they're providing a service for which it's proprietary service. Very funny, given what the Auditor General has found, and the legal audit perhaps is required. But in our view, government must take. It's crazy that a government does not own, does not have access or exclusive rights to its gateway. payments gateway. It's peculiar in other parts of the relative to other parts, best practice, for instance, and other parts of the world, and we've seen what's happening here. So in our view, this should be a gateway ownership should actually transfer to government sooner than later, almost immediately, and obviously that gateway should be regulated by the Central Bank of Kenya. And through that regulation as well, real-time access should be provided to the Treasury, to the KRA, of course, because some of that revenue is collected on its behalf. I mean, it's a system collecting revenue from government for government, and obviously to the Auditor General's office as well. Real-time access to this, even if it's only read-only access, fine. None of them should have other rights, but the ability to actually monitor on a day-to-day, even hour by hour, to determine whether this system is working well, but also those rights to a facility that is becoming essential. Actually, almost the backbone of government revenue collection is essential. Thank you.
So I'll just go straight to plenary, and I'd like to invite anyone who has a question, concern, a comment. Please raise your hand. Please raise your hand, and I will allow you to unmute yourself and ask whatever question you need to. So I see one. Your name is written Wolf. So Wolf, if you could please unmute yourself and let's hear your question. Wolf, is your...
Hello, can you?
Yes, I
can
can
you
hear
hear
you.
me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I found it much easier to just type in Wolf, but my name is Francis
Right.
Hook. I'm in the ICT space. So I have a question, and this has to do with the pricing, like the example that was given for honey and all that. And thinking of the proposals of introducing premium rates for certain services, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking there may be some merits to doing this, and perhaps it may bring about it may actually broaden the digital divide for those who have not. And it's still unclear how introducing premium services would solve certain issues like poor governance. So maybe Kwame and Leo would like to comment on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. I think we got your question clearly. Anyone else? Please raise your hand and I will allow you to clarify. Okay, as you prepare your questions, I think I'll ask Leo to respond.
You know, the essence, if government has already paid for the creation of the system, has already paid for the for all the other contracting obligations, and that has come through the taxpayer, obviously that any justification for other costs is not something that that would be acceptable. Government can price the actual service can be priced in to show, for example, that for example, a distinction between passports and many other services, including the e-visas, can be priced differently given the other consideration. But there is no justification to add a convenience fee if taxes have already been, or those costs have already been recovered through either the taxpayer, through the taxpayer. So it doesn't matter the classification of whether what is premium or not. If costs have already been recovered, then it just be for the user, for the charges for those. And remember, the Article 209 of the Constitution actually provides a guidelines that gives authority for how those services would be charged. And the expectation is that Parliament would be just and fair in the way in the setting of those rates. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Anyone else? If you have a question that you'd like to ask, Please raise your hand. Any comment, addition? There are none in the question box. So let me see. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask any question. As I ask our speakers to prepare their closing remarks. Yes, Murioki, I see your hand. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Murioki Mureithi.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate the work that these gentlemen have done in investigating and giving us this presentation. One thing I wanted to check is what is the institutional infrastructure of e-Citizen? There is the Ministry of ICT somehow involved. There is the Treasury involved. I think also the Ministry of Interior. Who is the institutional owner of e-Citizen? And so would have to be take the primary responsibility for its functioning. Thank you.
Thanks, Murioki. Anyone else who would like to get a clarification? I'd like this to be the final round. So if you have any question, please raise your hand so that our speakers can respond as they give their closing remarks. So there's one in the chat box. Any precedence, lesson, benchmark from other comparable jurisdictions on the convenience fee charged? I think, Leo, you started the presentation with giving us a global picture. So I was also interested to find out from your assessment if you were to rank or give priority to the reforms that are currently required for the effective performance of our e-Citizen platform. Where would you look, or what platform from the comparative perspectives that you gave us in your first slide, where would you look and what would that priority be that Kenya could realistically adopt in terms of immediate priority? I know we need all the reforms ASAP, but learning from our best peers, what would you say? So I'd just add that question to what Spice Ken here is asking. So does anyone else want to ask a question? Please raise your hand so that. Okay, so we'll start with you, Leo, again. Please go ahead and let's hear your response.
The e-Citizen has spanned two administrations. So in the first administration, this was developed by what they call the government digital payment system secretariat at National Treasury that actually conceptualized the initial work that was done around that. But again, we observe in the audit that the Auditor General the Auditor General noted that the management of the vendor, of payments for the vendor, went through the ICT authority, and that a Ministry of ICT and the Ministry of the National Treasury had collaborated in the earlier phases. However, the executive order, the number 1 of 2023, transferred e-Citizen services to Interior, and now that's where the whole institutional arrangement. But however, so the complication is here. There is the physical infrastructure part, which is now where the e-Citizen is currently domiciled at Interior, but there are settlement questions, and remember that the National Treasury is the entire treasury for the Republic, as that they are expected to provide some of those settlement services for that. So our distinction here is that the guiding element for the institution should be to that National Treasury remains as control over the accounts as control over the entire process. But the national digital gateway management should be regulated by the CBK. And then the Treasury can do disbursements subject to the way, subject to the other conditions. But this has to be defined through the legislation so that it doesn't keep moving now from, is it the digital payment unit? Is it the vendor doing certain mandates or not? And additionally, so that has to come through legislation on who does the settlement, who does the onboarding, who does the entire process. Because as it is, it's unclear. And that is it's actually the first finding of the Auditor General that majority of this the institutional arrangement, there is no clear institutional arrangement. Any precedence or lesson or benchmark from comparable jurisdictions? So one of the best systems that Kenya could benchmark is it's in Estonia, it's called the e-Estonia. And the e-Estonia costs are recovered through the budget. So government budgets for the revenue collection system, just like the way they do for care authority, for the revenue authority. And then that is recovered. And then there's no convenience fee, so that it's just payments for services that are done. But just to give other comparable, there's one in Rwanda that uses tired pricing, which is what is considered low value transactions. They pay a zero fee, and the number goes up as it goes up, but the cost is capped. So there is a cap. So they use tired pricing, but there is a cap. It can't exceed some nominal numbers. Another one is for India. For India, it uses a value band. They've created a value band above what they call the smaller transactions, and then the mid-range, and then the high transactions. And then others like Singapore, it's also zero. So for Kenya can go three ways. There's the first option that already exists, which is the convenience fee, which has adverse effects on public service. The second option could now be the value based, but the third option, and which is the most important, and that is the one that can only be lawful under the Constitution of Kenya, Chapter 12, would be that costs are recovered through the budget. Because if already base costs are covered, there's no need to charge additional fees on the same. Thank you. Kwame.
The concern for Francis was whether the imposition of premium rates for certain services would be disadvantageous to small to lower income people, and perhaps that's true. The government services already in Kenya are actually graduated in some ways. So you know that some places, well, more recent, government has been debating whether you can start a hastening fee. So for instance, if your license is takes 30 days to come for those people who are, or a passport, and for some reason, some people who might have an emergency, then obviously it could be processed much earlier with a certain fee. So I think, and in my view, in those cases, the fee should actually be incorporated in the initial cost going to government, and should not necessarily affect how much, say, a vendor collects in terms of the convenience fee. So that's my view about the design. But the second thing that I think is essential is, look, the model that lends itself, or that almost proposes that lends itself here, is because this infrastructure was entirely built from public funds. IFC contracted a specific fund to be on behalf of the government of Kenya. So the claims of proprietary ownership are, in my view, are very flimsy. In addition to the fact that you remember in January 2023, there was already an agreement between the ministry and the vendor farm to pass the source code and all those other things back to the public sector. So it should have been in the custody of the National Treasury. And in my view, the fact that it hasn't happened is, to an extent, lethargy, or perhaps just some hesitation on the part of the National Treasury that we need to find out a little bit more on. If that is the case, that these infrastructure, the initial development costs were already borne by the public sector and its partner, the IFC, then yes, the case that lends itself is basically government should actually allow entry and payment through this gateway system to be at no cost. So that regardless of what it is, you're paying 5,000 shillings for a passport, you need not have to pay an additional cost to service something for which infrastructure which the government of Kenya already paid for and is maintaining, which could be done through the taxes. If certain service obligations are introduced or something that is required for improvements, I think that too should be paid for in a structured way through budget allocations. So that now, in terms of Moroki Moredi, you're right. One of the things that you've seen, and Leo's mentioned it over these 14 years since this system was started, is that I think when it was started, it was experimental. It was started as a secretariat within the public sector. I mean, the Ministry of IT. As soon as everybody saw that, wow, this is a source for a lot of money, suddenly every government department. So we have the National Treasury now, I think, which is an appropriate place where it should reside. We have the Ministry of IT. I'm not too sure that just because it's a digital infrastructure means the IT ministry needs to be involved. I think they could help with ensuring that the standards are established and that, but I don't think that it should be. And then the third part, the third part is now Interior, which is usually, I worry in the public sector in Kenya because the moment Interior is introduced, and I don't see why they should care for a public system, in the integrity of a payment system and a gateway. Because in my view, the moment Interior comes in, you can bet it that down the line when an audit question surfaces, there'll be an argument and pushback from the Interior Ministry that there are certain security considerations which do not warrant the disclosure of some information. And that's not, so in my view, there's no reason for Interior to be here at all. None. Regulation by the Central Bank of Kenya, with certain service standards, just like any payment system. I think there's no justification. So in my view, who should have custody? Certainly, because it's a payment system, it's managing funds and revenues on behalf of the Republic, and obviously the National Treasury should be there. And I think not only just about service quality, but I'm talking about the legal framework, and the law should actually come in to tighten all these other things with parliamentary oversight as usual over anything that involves public finances at all. So as I conclude, what we are trying to highlight here is just basically how the government of Kenya, and I think there are certain vendors who find the government of Kenya a very easy one to fool, quote unquote, I use the word fools advisedly, because they come in with shiny PR things, talking about things that have worked elsewhere and giving the impression that they've actually created much. They haven't. I mean, the source codes and even open source information that could help in creating a robust system are already in place. So really, there's nothing that's really fanciful here, except for people locking it in to do that. So that's the first thing. So we need not treat these guys like they're some geniuses who cannot be questioned. That's not true. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, a facility such as this, which is only going to grow in terms of its use and government dependence on it, requires far more transparency than we are seeing here. And if, for instance, the legal interpretation is that it's owned by somebody else, then I think government of Kenya should junk it and actually build another system altogether through some competitive and free and open source codes that are available in other parts of the world. But the methods and the systems that we maintain do not provide good service quality, do not provide guarantees of operations. And obviously you can see significant discrepancies even in the amount of money that is collected and is remitted, in addition to inefficiencies when county governments or other state departments receive money on an average 8 days after that remittance was done, creating inefficiencies down the line. So what we have is completely unacceptable, regardless of whether any legal or criminal investigations go forward or not. What we have is completely inefficient, to be honest, and I don't think it should be maintained as an end in itself. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for those responses and the closing remarks. So at this point, I think I'll just bring this meeting to an end. Thanks to both our speakers for preparing the presentation and for sharing that with all of us. This presentation will be available on the IEA website immediately after this. So if you're interested, you can download a copy from there. And then the IEA is a membership institution. So for those of you who are not members but would like to be IEA members, please get in touch with our communications team and they can advise on the process. So thanks everyone for joining this discussion and for staying to the end. Look out for IEA further meetings on IEA's digital platforms. So on Twitter, DataX, you'll be able to see whenever such we have notices for this webinar. So thanks everyone, and we wish you a good afternoon.